The rain came down hard that night. Walt sat by his fire with a cup of cold tea, listening to the storm beat against the roof of his small cabin. He was used to the noise. He had slept through worse. Artillery. Thunder that shook the ground. The sound of things breaking that could not be put back together. Rain on a wooden roof was nothing. He was nearly asleep in his chair when he heard it. A scratch. Small and soft. Right at the base of his door. He opened his eyes and stared at the door for a moment. He thought it was a branch. The wind moved things around out there. He closed his eyes again. Then it came again. Scratch, scratch, scratch. Walt set down his cup and pushed himself out of the chair. His knees ached the way they always did in wet weather. He crossed the room slowly, pulled back the bolt, and opened the door. The wind and rain rushed in immediately, cold and sharp. Walt squinted against it and looked down. There was a drake on his doorstep. It was small. Very small. About the size of a large dog, maybe smaller. Its scales were dark green, soaked through with rain, and it was shaking from the cold. Its wings were pressed flat against its sides. Its eyes were big and pale gold, and they were fixed on Walt with an expression he had not expected to see on the face of a creature like that. It looked desperate. Walt stared at it. It stared back at him. He had seen drakes before, a few times, at a distance mostly. They lived deep in the forest beyond the settlement. People left them alone and they left people alone. That was the agreement, unspoken but understood. A full-grown drake was nothing to trouble yourself with. Even a young one could take off a hand if it wanted to. This one did not look like it wanted to take off anyone's hand. It looked like it had been running for a long time and had finally found the door it was looking for. Walt said, "What do you want?" The drake made a sound. It was low and broken, somewhere between a whimper and a cry. It stepped forward and pressed its small head against Walt's leg. Then it looked up at him. Then it turned and looked out into the dark and rain behind it. Then it looked back at Walt again. Walt understood animals. He had grown up around them. He had worked with dogs and horses most of his life, before the war and a little after. He knew when something was asking for help. He said, "No." The drake made the sound again. Walt said, "I'm an old man. It's raining. Whatever's out there is none of my business." The drake grabbed the hem of Walt's coat with its small clawed hands and pulled. Walt looked down at it. He looked at his coat being pulled. He looked at the dark trees beyond the doorstep, black and dripping in the storm. He thought about sitting back down by his fire. He thought about his cold tea. He thought about how much his knees already hurt. He stood there for a long moment. Then he sighed the way a man sighs when he already knows what he is going to do and is just a little annoyed about it. He went back inside and put on his heavy coat. He pulled on his boots. He took the old lantern from the hook beside the door and lit it with a match. He checked his belt out of habit, the way he had done for years before he stopped carrying anything on it worth checking. Then he stepped outside into the rain and pulled the door shut behind him. The drake was already moving, looking back over its shoulder to make sure Walt was following. Walt followed. The rain came down and the wind pushed through the trees and the lantern through a small circle of yellow light that barely touched the dark around them. The drake moved quickly for its size, darting between roots and stones, always stopping when it got too far ahead to wait for Walt to catch up. It never made that sound again. It seemed to understand that Walt had said yes and that was enough. Walt did not talk. He watched his footing. The ground was wet and soft and the roots were slippery. He was not a young man and a broken ankle out here in the dark would be a serious problem. He kept his eyes low and kept moving. He did not ask himself why he had come. He knew better than to ask that kind of question in the middle of something. You asked those questions later, sitting down when the thing was done. In the middle of it you just moved. The trees grew thicker as they went. The settlement lights disappeared behind him. There was nothing ahead but dark and rain and the small wet shape of the drake moving through the lantern light. Walt had walked into worse places with less reason. He had followed orders into dark places and loud places and places where the ground shook and the air tasted like smoke. He had come out of most of them. He figured he could follow a small crying drake into a forest. He just did not know yet what he was going to find when he got there. The drake stopped at the edge of a slope that dropped down into a hollow. It looked at Walt. It made a small sound, quieter than before, and looked down into the dark below. Walt lifted the lantern and looked down. He could see something large at the bottom. Something that was not moving the way it should. He tightened his grip on the lantern and started down the slope. Walt made it down the slope slowly. The ground was soft and wet at the bottom, more mud than soil, and his boots sank a little with each step. The lantern swung in his hand and the light moved across the hollow in uneven sweeps. Tree roots stuck out from the walls of the hollow like old fingers. The rain still came down but quieter here, broken up by the thick canopy above. Then the lantern light found her. Walt stopped walking. She was enormous. Even collapsed on her side, she took up most of the hollow floor. Her scales were dark, a deep brown that might have been rich and warm in good health but looked dull now, like stone left out in the cold too long. Her wings were folded tight against her body, not in rest but in the way that something folds when it no longer has the strength to hold itself open. Her tail lay still in the mud. Her neck was stretched out flat on the ground. Her eyes were closed. Walt stood very still and watched her sides. For one long second he thought he was too late. Then he saw it. A slow rise. A slow fall. She was breathing. Barely. But breathing. Pip ran past Walt's legs and pressed itself against her mother's neck, making that low broken sound again. The little drake nuzzled under Sorra's jaw and stayed there, shaking. Not from cold this time. From something else entirely. Walt had seen fear before. He had seen it in people and in animals. He knew what it looked like when something small was terrified of losing the one thing it needed most. He moved closer. He crouched down a few feet from Sorra's head and held the lantern up. Her scales near her jaw were damp, but not from rain. There was a heat coming off her that Walt could feel from where he crouched. The kind of heat that came from inside. The kind that meant the body was fighting something hard and losing ground. He had seen fever like this before. Not in a dragon. But he had seen it. He set the lantern down in the mud and reached out slowly. He put the back of his hand close to her neck without touching. The heat rolled off her skin like standing near a fire. Her breathing was slow and uneven, with a slight catch at the top of each breath that Walt did not like the sound of. He sat back on his heels and thought. He was not a doctor. He had never been a doctor. He had been a soldier, and before that a farmer's son, and the medical knowledge he carried was the rough practical kind. The kind you learned when help was far away and waiting was not an option. He knew how to clean a wound. He knew how to bring a fever down when there was nothing else to do it with. He knew how to keep something alive through a night when the odds were not good. He looked at Sorra. He looked at Pip pressed against her mother's neck with those pale gold eyes watching him. He thought about standing up. He thought about the walk back through the rain and the warm cabin and the cold tea still sitting by the fire. He was old. His knees hurt. This was not his problem. He stayed crouched in the mud. He moved the lantern slowly along Sorra's side, looking. He was not sure what he was looking for exactly, but he had learned a long time ago that looking carefully was the first step to anything useful. He moved past her folded wing and stopped. There it was. Just below the joint where her left wing met her back, half hidden under the edge of the folded wing, was a wound. It was not large. That was the thing about bad wounds sometimes. They did not have to be large. This one was deep and dark and the skin around it was swollen and tight and a color that was wrong in a way Walt recognized immediately. Infected. Badly. He leaned closer. The wound had been there for a while. Days maybe. Long enough for the infection to move inward. Long enough to explain the fever and the collapsed breathing and the dull scales. Whatever had caused it, a branch, a rock, a fight with something, it had not been treated and now the body was paying for that. Walt looked at it for a long moment. Then he looked at Pip. The little drake was watching him with those big pale eyes. There was something in them beyond fear now. Something quieter. Like the part of a person that has run as far as it can run and has put everything into one last hope and is now just waiting to see if that hope was worth it. Walt had seen that look too. In other places. In harder times. He stood up slowly with his knees complaining the whole way. He said quietly and mostly to himself, "All right." He looked around the hollow. There were things he needed. Dry wood if he could find any under the root overhangs. Clean water was harder but the rain was still running off the slope and he could work with that. He had a small knife on his belt, old habit, and the cloth lining of his coat was clean enough if he had to use it. It was not much. But he had done more with less. He looked down at Sorra one more time. Her chest rose slowly. Fell slowly. The little catch at the top was still there. He crouched back down beside her and put his hand gently on her side. Just rested it there. He did not know if she could feel it. He did not know if it meant anything to her. But he was not leaving. That much he knew. Walt started with the fire. He needed light and he needed warmth, and without those two things nothing else was going to work. He moved along the edges of the hollow, checking under the root overhangs and the thick base of the old trees where the rain had not reached. He found enough dry bark and dead wood to get something going. Not a big fire. Just enough. He built it a few feet from Sorra's side, close enough to push heat toward her but not so close it would startle her if she came around. He worked quickly, the way he always worked when there was something that needed doing, and thinking too much about it would only slow him down. The fire caught on the third match. He fed it carefully until it was steady and low and reliable. Then he turned back to the wound. He crouched beside Sorra's left side and moved her wing gently. She did not react. That worried him a little. A dragon in good health would have pulled away from an unknown hand touching its wing. She was too far under to notice. He folded the wing back just enough to see clearly and held the lantern close. It was worse up close. The wound itself was narrow, maybe 2 inches across, but deep. The skin around it had pulled tight and dark, and there was a smell coming off it that Walt knew from experience and did not like. The infection had been sitting in there for days, going deeper, spreading slowly into the tissue around it. The fever was the body trying to burn it out and not quite managing. He pulled his knife and held the blade in the fire for a count of 30. Pip made a sharp sound behind him. Walt looked over his shoulder. The little drake was standing rigid, staring at the knife, every small muscle tight. Walt said, "Easy. I'm not hurting her. I'm trying to help." Pip did not look convinced. But it did not move closer. Walt turned back and worked carefully. He was not a surgeon. He did not pretend to be. But he knew that a wound like this needed to be opened and cleaned before anything else could happen. Leaving it sealed over a pocket of infection was the same as doing nothing. He had learned that the hard way a long time ago in a field where there were no doctors and no time, and you just had to do what needed doing with what you had. He worked slowly. He was careful. Sorra's breathing changed once, a deeper pull of air, and her body shifted slightly, but she did not wake. Walt kept going. When the wound was open, he used rainwater he had collected in the curved hollow of a piece of bark, pouring it slowly and letting it run. He used a strip of cloth from the inside lining of his coat, clean and dry, to press and clear. He did this again and again, patient and methodical, not rushing, because rushing made mistakes, and mistakes here were not something he could afford. Pip came closer while he worked. The little drake settled about a foot away and watched every movement Walt made with those pale gold eyes. It did not interfere. It seemed to understand that something careful was happening and that interrupting it would be wrong. But every time Walt paused to rest his hands or think through the next step, Pip would lean forward and press its small nose against Walt's arm. Just a nudge. Just enough. Walt would take a breath and keep going. The night stretched out long and quiet around them. The rain thinned after a while and then stopped altogether, leaving the forest dripping and still. The fire popped and breathed. Somewhere far off in the trees an owl called once and went silent. Walt worked and Pip watched, and Sorra breathed her slow, uneven breaths. Walt's back ached. His knees had stopped complaining and gone numb, which was either better or worse, he was not sure. His hands were steady though. They had always been steady when it mattered. That was one thing the years had not taken from him. He kept the fire fed. Every time it dropped he added a piece of wood, slow and careful so the light stayed even. He checked Sorra's breathing regularly, counting the seconds between each rise and fall of her chest. The catch at the top was still there, but it was smaller than before. Something was shifting, slowly, in the right direction. He did not let himself think about whether it would be enough. He just kept working. Sometime around what he guessed was midnight, the fire had settled into a deep, steady burn, and the hollow was warmer than it had any right to be. Walt was sitting with his back against a root, resting his hands, watching Sorra's side rise and fall. Pip was curled against her mother's neck again, eyes half closed but not sleeping, just keeping watch in its own way. Walt was thinking about nothing in particular. Then Sorra opened her eyes. It was slow. The way something opens when it has been very far away and is finding its way back. Her eyes were large and deep amber, and they caught the firelight and held it. She did not lift her head. She did not move at all. She just opened her eyes and they found Walt sitting there against the root with his tired hands in his lap. She looked at him. Walt looked back. Neither of them said anything. There was nothing to say that the moment did not already hold. She was here and he was here, and the fire was burning and Pip was safe at her neck, and the long terrible night had not finished them. That was enough. Walt gave her a small nod. Sorra closed her eyes again slowly, and her next breath came a little easier than the one before. The sky began to change somewhere above the trees. Walt could not see it from inside the hollow, but he could feel it. The darkness thinned. The air shifted. The kind of quiet that belongs only to the very early morning settled over the forest like something being laid down gently. The fire had burned low and the coals glowed orange and soft in the gray light that was beginning to find its way down through the canopy. Walt was still sitting against the root. He was not sure when he had stopped moving. At some point in the last hour he had simply run out of things to do and had sat down and stayed there. His coat was damp and heavy. His hands were in his lap, palms up, and they were shaking slightly. Not from cold. From the kind of tired that goes all the way down to the middle of a person and sits there. He was old. He had known that for a while. but some nights reminded him more than others. He looked at Sorra. Her color had changed. It was subtle, the kind of thing you would miss if you were not looking for it, but Walt had been looking at her for hours and he saw it clearly. The dull, flat look of her scales was gone. There was something warmer in them now, a faint depth that had not been there in the dark of the night. Her sides rose and fell in a rhythm that was steady and even. The catch at the top of each breath, that small wrong sound that had worried him from the beginning, was gone. Walt let out a long, slow breath of his own. He had not realized he had been holding so much of himself tight all through the night until he felt it release. His shoulders dropped. His head fell back against the root behind him. He stared up at the pale morning sky showing in pieces through the leaves above and felt the full weight of every hour land on him all at once. His hands would not stop shaking. He pressed them flat against his legs and that helped a little but not much. His knees were bad. His back was a long conversation he did not want to have. There was a dull pain behind his eyes that came from too many hours of close careful work in firelight. He was cold in the way that gets into the joints and stays there. He thought about the walk back. Through the wet forest. Up the slope. Across the dark ground to his cabin. His chair by the fire. Dry clothes. He was not sure his legs would carry him yet. He decided not to find out immediately. But moved. The little Drake had been curled at Sorra's neck for the last hour, very still, watching the slow rise and fall of her mother's breathing with those pale gold eyes. Now Pip lifted its head and looked around the hollow in the careful way of a small creature checking that the world is still where it left it. Then Pip looked at Walt. Walt looked back. Pip climbed down from Sorra's side carefully, picking each step like the ground might shift. It crossed the hollow floor on small quiet feet and reached Walt and stood in front of him for a moment, looking up at his face. Then it climbed into his lap. It was heavier than it looked. Warm too, the deep steady warmth of a creature that had been pressed against its mother all night. It turned itself around once and then settled, tucking its head against Walt's chest and closing its eyes. Walt sat very still. He did not move for a long time. He just sat there with the little Drake in his lap and his shaking hands and the pale morning growing slowly around him. After a while he brought one hand up and rested it on Pip's back. He could feel the small ribs rising and falling. Quick light breaths. Already nearly asleep. Walt looked up at the trees. He did not cry. He was not a man who cried easily. But there was something moving through him in that moment that did not have a simple name. Something old and tired and also, underneath all of that, something that felt strangely like being found. He sat with it quietly. Sorra's voice came low and rough, the way a voice sounds when it has not been used in days. She said, "Why did you stay?" It was not quite a question. It came out flat and careful, like she was not sure her voice would hold and was testing it slowly. Walt looked at her. Her eyes were open, that deep amber catching the thin morning light. She had not moved. Her head was still on the ground. But she was watching him with an expression he could not fully read and was not sure he was meant to. Walt thought about the question. He thought about all the answers he could give. That he was a veteran and old habits did not die. That he had seen the look in Pip's eyes and could not walk away from it. That he had spent enough years walking into hard places that one more did not seem worth refusing. All of those things were true. But they were not the whole truth. He said, "I don't know how to walk away." He said it simply. Without weight. The way you say a thing that has been true for so long it has stopped feeling like a choice and started feeling like a fact about yourself. Sorra looked at him for a long moment. She said nothing more. She closed her eyes slowly and her breathing stayed steady and even in the quiet morning air. Pip shifted in Walt's lap and made a small sound and went still again. Walt sat between them both and let the morning come. 3 weeks passed. Walt went back to his life the way a man goes back to a room he has lived in so long he stops seeing it. He woke early. He made his fire. He drank his tea while it was still hot, which was something he had started doing again without quite noticing. He fixed the loose board on his porch that had been loose for 2 years. He chopped wood he did not strictly need yet because the work was good for his hands and his hands needed something to do. He did not go back into the forest. He thought about it sometimes. In the evenings mostly, when the fire was low and the cabin was quiet and there was nothing between him and his own thoughts. He wondered if Sorra had recovered fully. He wondered if the wound had stayed clean or if it had troubled her again. He wondered if Pip had grown any the way young things grew fast when they were healthy and safe. He did not let himself wonder too long. Wondering too long about things you could not check on was a habit that led nowhere good. He had learned that lesson more than once. He told himself they were fine. He almost believed it. The morning the scratching came again was an ordinary morning. Gray sky, cool air, the smell of wood smoke from his chimney and wet earth from the night's rain. Walt was at the table with his tea and a piece of bread he was not particularly hungry for. The fire was going. The cabin was warm. Everything was as it always was. Then he heard it. Scratch, 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 low at the base of the door. Small and careful. Walt set down his cup. He sat very still for a moment. He was aware of something moving in his chest. Not quite feeling and not quite thought. Something in between. He pushed back his chair and crossed the room and put his hand on the bolt. He stopped there for just a second. Then he opened the door. Pip sat on the porch. The little drake was bigger. Not dramatically, not the kind of growth you would measure, but the difference was there if you had seen it before. The frame was fuller. The scales had a healthy shine that caught even the flat gray morning light. The pale gold eyes were bright and steady and fixed on Walt's face with an expression that was not desperate this time. It was something else. Something calmer and deeper than desperation. There was something in Pip's mouth. The little drake held it carefully, the way you hold something you have carried a long way and do not want to drop. It stepped forward and set it down on the porch boards at Walt's feet and stepped back and looked up at him. Walt looked down. It was a stone. Smooth and oval, the kind that came from a riverbed, worn down over years by moving water until every edge was gone and only the quiet rounded shape remained. It was a dark gray with a faint trace of brown through the middle. And it was warm. Not from Pip's mouth but from something deeper than that. The kind of warm that the sun puts into a stone over a long summer afternoon and the stone holds onto through the evening. Walt crouched down slowly. He picked it up. It sat in his palm and he looked at it for a long time. He turned it once. Ran his thumb across the surface. It was very smooth. Someone had chosen this stone carefully. Not grabbed the first one at the water's edge but looked until they found the right one. He looked up from the stone. Past Pip. Past the porch edge. Past the yard and the woodpile and the line of scrubby grass that marked where his land ended and the forest began. Sorra stood at the tree line. She was fully upright. Her head was high and her wings were folded neatly at her sides and her scales were rich and deep in color, nothing like the dull collapsed creature he had found in the hollow 3 weeks ago. She was watching him with those amber eyes, steady and calm, from across the distance between them. She did not move closer. She did not need to. Walt looked at her for a moment. Then he gave her the same small nod he had given her that night by the fire when she had opened her eyes and found him still there. Simple. Plain. One person acknowledging another across a distance. Sorra dipped her head slowly in return. Walt stood up with the stone still in his hand. He looked down at Pip, who was watching him with those bright, patient eyes. He stepped back from the door and held it open. Pip walked inside without hesitation, claws clicking lightly on the wooden floor, and went straight to the fire and sat beside it as if it had done this 100 times before. Walt closed the door. He stood in the middle of his cabin with the warm stone in one hand and looked around the room. At the fire. At the chair. At the table with his half-finished tea. At Pip sitting by the hearth looking perfectly comfortable and completely at home. He went to the shelf beside the fire where he kept one bowl for water. He looked at it for a moment. Then he took a second bowl from the cabinet, filled it from the bucket by the door, and set it on the floor next to the first one. He set the smooth river stone on the shelf above them where he would see it every morning. He sat down in his chair. Pip looked at him. Walt looked at Pip. Outside, the gray morning was quietly becoming something brighter. The clouds were thinning. A pale light was beginning to come through the cabin window, slow and steady, the way good things tend to arrive when you have stopped watching for them. Walt picked up his tea. It was still warm.